Okay, let me see if I can do this fairly briefly. Difference between this stuff has just been kind of fell through the cracks in the news coverage, but the difference between preventive and preemptive war, it gets used almost interchangeably, and they're not. They're two different things. Preemptive is if you're anticipating, if you can see that there's weaponry and military that's assembled against you and it's about to attack, you take the initiative and attack first because it's clear that an attack is impending. So when the Russians gathered on the borders of Ukraine, were the Ukrainians have to have taken it seriously and had to have taken seriously and crossed the border and attacked the assembled troops. Of course, they didn't believe it at the time, but sure enough, the Russians were attacking. The Russians were more or less a preventive attack in that, in the absence of any organized, pre-dawn launch on the part of the Ukrainians, the Russians perceived that there was a threat from Ukraine and took the initiative to attack. Of course, they were attacking civilian residences, which is a war crime. A more or less justifiable example of preventive war is the 1981 Israeli bombing of the Asyric nuclear facility in Iraq. That was seen as preventive. You're developing a nuclear weapon. You're screaming for the death of Israel. It's going to be a great suicide war. We're taking out the facility, and that was 1981. Also, something from history. In 1980s, there was the so-called tanker war, and that was in the Gulf of, it was in Hormuz, Straits of Hormuz, and shipping was, I thought, entirely halted. They're saying now that this is unprecedented. We, of course, didn't. Well, we had quite the energy crisis back in the 70s, and this was part of the mix. So this is somewhat there are precedents for this. Furthermore, another bit of news that's kind of we haven't heard a lot about is that there apparently, according to AP and with some other sources, there has been some freight that's gone through Hormuz, and it's notably Chinese and Indian. We're not hearing about it in the American media, but apparently Italy and India is in discussions with Iran to be allowed to go through the straits. Of course, it's mined pretty heavily, so it's not the easiest trip to take. But apparently, it is not an absolute blockade, although it's being treated as such. So, three little bits of news that you may have missed.